Hey, I'm Kyle, and you're watching the Newfoundland Hobbyists.
Hey, I'm Kyle. Taking such good care about this one. We're proud of this right here.
The Newfoundland Hobbyist is sponsored by Mid-Island Motorsports, located in Springdale, Newfoundland. www.edgeproinc.com. By the Sea Inn and Cafe, located in Kings Point. And Outdoor Pros, located in Mount Pearl, Newfoundland.
Now, this show, the Newfoundland Hobbyist, has been on the air now for, this is its third season. So a few people have seen it at this point. And at times, I get to meet people, strangers out in public, that come up to me and say, I watch your show, or I like your show. Now, I would say 85% of that conversation so far goes something like this. I like your show. Of course, I express my appreciation. The next thing is, buddy, you can put edge on a knife. It's something on the lines of that. So thank you, I've been at it a while, you know, working on the craft. Their next line, and I'm not kidding, I've heard this so many times. You know, I never really could put a good edge on a knife. Something I never could do, never could get. I've heard that so many times, and at this point I keep saying, anytime someone says that, I say, I hear that so much. You know, you're not in the boat alone. A lot of people experience the same type of thing. It's not, if you haven't invested some time and a little bit of money and resources, putting a real good edge on a knife or a tool is not that easy. It does take some skill, does take the right tool set, and I figured, I've already talked about this on the show, but I figured we would go back over sharpening again today for you guys that are still struggling with the concept of sharpening a knife. Now, stone sharpening can be broken down into two main types. You have freehand stone sharpening here, which is very traditional. You just have a brick stone and the skills are on you. And you also have guided stone sharpening. Now, probably some of you guys haven't seen this system before. This is the Edge Pro, hfattps.com. They're one of the sponsors of the show. They make a beautiful system with a whole series of stones that clamp in this guide. You can set your angle, you clamp in your blade, and your angle is fixed. This is a wonderful system. It does take up some space. The stones are small, so they wear out a little quicker. The beauty of this system is that you don't need to spend hours and hours and hours learning how to maintain an angle. It removes that factor from the equation. It removes some of the human error. So this is just a beautiful system. It's expensive, but definitely a wonderful system to have, and you can keep it in the house. You can keep it beneath your kitchen counter down the cupboard. It's just wonderful. Now, my favorite type of sharpening is completely freehand. These rocks here represent cutting particles in a whetstone. So in a stone like this, a very pretty stone, we have a certain size particle in here that cuts steel. The particles are designed to cut steel. Now, the type of cutting particles we have here all depends on the stone you have, whether it's silicon carbide or zirconia or ceramic or diamond. The cutting particles are going to vary, but mainly the whole system is based on grits. Now, a really coarse stone, like a 200 grit stone, would have really big grit. Now, of course, this is an exaggeration, but these big particles like this, they cut really fast. They do a lot of damage really quickly, but of course your edge is going to be left really rough. As you progress further up here, you're going to get particles that are smaller, so they aren't going to cut as fast. For example, this little tiny piece of grit here, it's not going to do all the damage to a piece of steel, but it will produce a finish that's very polished and refined. You need to pick a set of stones or set of tools to allow you to do that. Now you can see here on the workbench I have a whole ton of different stones, right from cheaper stuff, hardware store type stuff, which does have their use. I'm not saying it's garbage or useless. It's useful for putting a crude edge on a crude tool really quick. Might work good for an axe, might work good for a real quick and rough chisel edge or a plane edge, just to get it into shape for you to finish up a rough project. But they aren't going to produce fine edges because they're low-end stones, they're of coarse grits, and they're not really where you want to put your money and value, in my opinion. Now when it comes to you selecting a stone for your purposes, the main thing you want to look at is what grits do you want or need. And like I said in the beginning, that comes down to what you're going to be sharpening. If you're just going to be sharpening a pocket knife and you don't want a razor sharp edge, you may only want to go up to about a 1000 grit, and that will produce a beautiful edge. Now a 1000 grit is going to be a little bit fine, and it's going to take a long time to restore an edge if you're someone that's always putting little nicks and chips in your edge. So you're probably going to want to also pick up something down around like a 400, a 320, somewhere around that range to be your workhorse to put a good edge on, and then you can refine it with the 1000. So that is sort of your baseline set of stones, in my opinion. Something around between the 200 and 400 range to be your workhorse, and then something around the 1000 grit, which will give you a nice clean working edge, and that'll give you an edge to work pretty much for everything. Now paulsfinest.com, they're a sponsor of the show, and they're where I get most of my sharpening gear. If you head there, pretty much any type of stone they have on that site is a good quality stone, and they give handwritten reviews and stuff on most of the stones. Very nice. Then you won't have to worry about wondering what's a good brand yourself. You go there, they have the good brands, you're safe picking something from there. So if you shop somewhere that's reputable, chances are they're going to have good quality stones, and you can just pick your grits that you know you're going to want based on what I said. You can pick those within that brand and have fun with it from there. Now for the baseline, like I said, you're going to want that 400 or so grit stone, you're going to want the 1000 grit stone. I would also highly recommend picking up a stone holder. This is a Nanawa stone holder, just the basic one. I think it's about 30 bucks. You can also get it on Paul's Finest, but it's really handy because it has rubber bottoms and it grips your stone. So it keeps your stone up off the bench or table or kitchen counter, whatever, and it helps it stick from sliding around. Highly recommend one of these. In addition to that, I would recommend a Nagura stone. This is a little block of stone, similar type material to what your sharpening stone is going to be made of, but it's going to be made for scrubbing down the surfaces of your stone, taking out little bumps and dips, taking out little dislodged particles and stuff, and just keeping your stone clean and fresh. I would recommend one of these. Lastly, I would recommend a leather strop, just because it's really nice for refining your edge and maintaining your edge. A strop, especially with a little bit of polishing compound like this, can do wonders at restoring an edge that's just got a little bit more dull.
The Newfoundland Hobbyist is sponsored by paulsfinest.com, Noble's Timber Mart with locations in Springdale and Bay Verte, wildmedkits.ca, Robinson's General Store located in Middle Arm, and ABS Busing, also located in Middle Arm, Newfoundland.
Now one of the beauties of the modern whetstone is that they're pretty much all water stones. Stones to be soaked in water. So maybe you could pick up a small container like this, big enough to store your stones in, and it also doubles as a little basin to soak your stones in. So I've just got them here now. I'm going to let them soak for probably 5 or 10 minutes. Just lukewarm, like room temperature water. And we'll get to the fun part, the sharpening process. Now my knife to sharpen today is this lovely Sentoku. This is the first kitchen knife I ever made on my own. I had made a couple knives before this, but I decided one day to attempt a kitchen knife. This is what I came up with, and I have made several off of this pattern since, but I use this knife pretty much every day in my kitchen, and every so often it needs to be sharpened, and we're going to take care of that today. Now I've been sharpening this knife lately up to a 1000 grit. And that's sort of the texture I like my edge to be. It might be something you want to play around with, but I don't want like a high polished 6000 grit. It's not it's not my preferred edge to cut with. I like the 1000. I like it to be a little bit more grabby, and I just find it works better in meats and things like that. Now this edge is dull enough from its few months of use in the kitchen that I do want to start with my coarser stone. I think I even have a nick there right in the center, so I'm going to want to remove that with, I'm going to use a 400 grit stone. This is a Nanawa Super Stone, a 400 grit. It's a lovely stone, and that's what we're going to be using. Clamp that in my holder, and now when you're about to start, when you guys get your shiny new stones, you're about to learn how to sharpen your knife, there are a few questions you're going to have. The questions that anyone has is what angle to hold your blade at, how much pressure to use. Those are the two questions. Now for angle, I always say the exact same thing. That is to lay your blade flat on the stone, like so. If you have a pocket knife, you can do it exactly the same way. Lay it flat on the stone. Tip up your blade until the shadow disappears under the very edge, the very apex of your blade. Once that shadow disappears, it means that blade has laid flat. That bevel has laid flat on your stone, and you want to try to hold that angle, try to maintain that angle at that point. So I would do that same thing with my kitchen knife. I'm going to lay it right here. I'll use a flashlight here to exaggerate what I'm talking about, but just under your naked eye, under normal kitchen light, you will be able to see this shadow under the blade. You can see it closing up there. And as I tip this down, so you can see I've laid it on this flat bevel here, and it almost disappears. We still have a little touch of black you can see under your edge. But as I tip that blade up, at a certain point, that shadow disappears. You see that? If you're back a little bit, just right there, you can see that hint of shadow appear again. Once you tip it up to a certain point, that shadow's going to disappear, and that's your sharpening angle. Now the one other main question you're going to have is how much pressure to use when you're sharpening. Now, I don't have a very good way. It's really hard to describe that. It's almost something you have to feel. Different stones will react a little bit differently than others. But what I'm going to use here is this open-celled sponge. So this is just a general like dollar store sponge. You can see the texture of it. Now I'm going to place this right under my stone holder. You can see if I push down here, it bears up pretty good, but it does sink in. Let's get it close to the edge so you can see it. Now, when I start to sharpen here, maybe you'll get some idea of how much pressure I'm using. Now with a coarser stone, I'll use more pressure than with a finer stone. Let me get my sleeve out of the way there. That is the amount of pressure. I don't know if that helps. I hope it does. It's a really hard thing to tell you because it's not a thing that you can measure in pounds per inch, or I guess if you really got scientific and got the equipment together, you could come up with that, but it's probably best, one of those things best felt. Now I usually start by putting the toe or the tip of my knife on a stone. My finger will lay on the tip of the blade, just like so. And I'll start with a stroke pushing away from my body. Then I'll pull back in. I lay my thumb in on the blade to keep good downward pressure. And I just use my two hands to lock the blade back and forth like you're seeing here. And you're trying to maintain that angle, so you try to lock your wrists and everything into place for that angle. And you're just working back and forth. Fairly even pressure. I usually use a little bit more pressure on the cutting stroke or when I'm coming into the edge than I do on the reverse stroke. But you want good even pressure, and you're just cutting away steel. That is, this whole process is to cut away steel, and on this coarse stone like this, you're cutting away steel until you have a new edge established. till you've removed any nicks, dents, chips, anything you want out of there. You've created the shape you want on your edge. So that's what I'm going to work towards. I often get a question like, do you count how many strokes, how much time you spend on each side of the blade? I do not. I just use the amount of work that needs to be used to establish an even edge on both sides. So I'll work until I get there. I'm not going to stop if it's not even, just because I've reached a certain number of strokes. So I'll just switch back and forth every so often, maybe every 20 or 30 seconds I'll switch. And every so often I'll check my edge to see how things are looking. Now, if we take a cross section of a knife edge that is really dull, what you're likely to have is this right here. So this is your edge. This is your edge here. This would come out here to the tip of your knife, right? So we're looking at a microscopic cross section of your blade. And notice that it's dull. It doesn't come to a beautiful apex. It comes to a rounded, this is an exaggeration again, but it's rounded. We don't have that real nice spearhead. So your goal is to sharpen that until we turn that dull edge into a nice spearhead or a nice apex. So you're removing the steel till we get back to here. So you have to remove some steel. It may take some time depending on how dull your edge is. Once you get to that point, once these two facets meet, you're likely to get what's called a burr, and that is a little bit of wire, a wire edge fold over. As those two edges meet and cross over, you get this little weak bit of wire hanging off your edge. Now, how you deal with that wire burr can make all the difference to your final edge. Now, as I'm getting close to that point here with my 400 grit, there are a couple things to consider. First off, how do I know if I get that burr? First off, you should know that you're getting close to that point because you can see your edge is going from dull to an apex. When a burr actually forms, you can usually see it in the light dangling. There will be a sharp line of reflection right at the edge of your knife. Sometimes the burr will be so drastic, especially if your stone you're using is real coarse, the burr will be so significant that it'll actually hang off a little bit of wire, a little bit of curly wire might hang off a portion of your edge. If neither of those are overly detectable, you can't see them very well. One thing you can do is drag your blade in reverse across a sensitive part of your skin. Even your fingernail might work. If you drag it in reverse, of course, if you imagine that piece of steel running backwards across your hand, there shouldn't really be any resistance. There shouldn't really be any drag as that happens. But if you do feel that sort of pull, that slight drag on your fingernail too, if you drag it in reverse, if you feel any drag, that is a burr, and you'll need to remove that. Now, one thing I like to do is run my edge very lightly through a piece of leather or piece of softwood. Just draw it just nice and light like that, and it'll help pull off any excess dangly bits. What I'll do after that is just use single cutting strokes, just like so, a little bit lighter. So 1-for-1 strokes like this. I'll do that for a little bit, and every once in a while I'll have another look at my edge and another feel. What I want to do is make sure that I do have a real nice sharp edge without a burr, or with very minimal, pretty much undetectable burr, because it may still be there on some microscopic level, but you want it to be almost undetectable. If you do not remove that burr, you have a nice big wire burr, you're feeling that and you're thinking that's your grabby edge, you keep going through different grits without removing it, at some point that burr is going to detach, you're going to be left with a dull edge again. and you've already worked up to fine grit, so you'll have to go back down to a coarser grit again and reestablish that burr and handle it properly. So you'll want to properly get rid of it at the start, and then you can work up from there. So take your time. This is especially difficult to understand and detect when you're new at sharpening, but you'll get the hang of it. You just need to pay attention to the work that you're doing. So I'm going to take this knife now, and I just did that for demonstration, of course. I'm going to take this knife and work it up till I get that burr. Now if you notice, as I'm just finishing up with the 400 grit, I've just created an apex. You can actually see what I was talking about there, a little bit of wire burr right about here. Really hard to detect on the camera, but it's there. And you notice all those little bits of fiber along the edge. If you drag your edge along your sleeve or something like that, and there is a burr, that little bit of wire is going to grab onto little fibers and stuff. So that's another useful way to detect if you have a burr. So to start dealing with that burr, I'll just graze my edge slightly through a piece of leather. Looks pretty clean there now. Now I'll just do some lighter single passes and check once more, just to make sure we do have a nice clean apex before we move on. Now this is a Shapton glass, 1000 grit. Well, it's technically a 1000 mesh, which is a little bit higher than a 1000 grit, but it cuts like a 1000 grit. I'm going to start out with the exact same set of steps. Lay your blade on your stone, tip up until your shadow disappears, and we'll go back now to the back and forth strokes. We don't need to stay with the single strokes because we're going to work up through the same set of steps again. What you want to do once you move up in a grit like this is work to remove the previous scratches. So I'm trying to use this 1000 grit stone to remove all the scratches from our 400 grit stone. Now that may take a little while, depends on how fast your stone cuts, how much pressure you're using, but that is the goal here now. Since we've already taken the edge from that rounded dull edge to an apex, we're not trying to do that again. That's already done for us. So right now we're trying to refine it. We're going to stop right there. You could go to a much higher grit. We could work all the way up to that 8000 grit stone, and this thing would be gleaming. It would just be a gorgeous mirror polish. But that's not necessary for the work I'm going to do with it. It's wasting time, and it's an edge that 99% of people will not need or really notice much difference in. Most of your general kitchen tasks or EDC tasks for your pocket knives and things like that, any of your like fishing knives, your fillet knives, this 1000 grit right here is an edge that you will love. You can even see there that with that 1000 grit, we are clipping hairs. And just like that, my kitchen knife is back up to tip-top shape. We will go in and cook something this evening. But now you guys that come up to me in the grocery stores, you have no excuse for never being able to get a good edge. I just showed you using two stones, a 400 and a 1000 here. Neither of these stones are that expensive. You don't even need the stone holder, although it helps. I showed you with just those two stones how to get a lovely edge that'll work well for any of your knives, whether hunting, fishing, your kitchen knives, your pocket knife, anything like that. That edge will be beautiful. Of course, you can work up to 3000 grit, 4000 grit, and 8000 grit and have just a gleaming edge to impress everyone. You could do that. You could pick up a few pieces of leather and glue it to a piece of wood to have a nice strap. You could do that and have just better and better edges. This is such a cool hobby that is so obviously useful. Everyone needs a sharp knife. If you have never experienced a beautifully sharpened knife, you're really missing out. And I'm sure a lot of people are in that situation, but it's just a beautiful hobby to get into, very useful for yourself, for your family, your friends. If you could pick up a few tools, learn this skill, I know you'll never regret it. I know all you guys that come up to me wish that you could put a real nice edge on your wife's kitchen knives. Maybe you like to cook yourself. I know you'd like to be able to put a good edge on it. Hopefully this video helps you do that. Thank you guys for watching this episode. I really appreciate it. A big thank you to the sponsors of the show, particularly in this episode, paulsfinest.com and Edge Pro Sharpening, or edgeproinc.com. If you guys want to check those sites out for some of their gear, please go ahead and do that. But thank you to the rest of the sponsors as well. As always, make sure you tune in next week to the Newfoundland Hobbyists.